Rick 3, shouted umpire Billy Golden in his newsy baritone at the end of the first half of the third inning at tiny Admiral Fetterman Field in Pensacola, Florida, home of the Pensacola Blue Wahoos, the Double-A affiliate of the Miami Marlins. On orders from above, scout Sam Casper was at his usual spot at the Admirals to check on the progress of Davy Golden Eagle Boyd, selected by the Marlins with the #1 pick in the draft 2 years ago. It was the scout's second trip to Pensacola this season. It seems the big club was hoping to have last year's bonus kid ready to go by September, and trusted the opinion of none other than Casper, who has been scouting for them for 18 years. In Casper's opinion, Boyd, who was posting a nice .286 batting average with 12 homers and 36 rebounds in mid-June, has so far justified the $1.75 million bonus the Marlins paid him when they signed him last year. The 24-year-old 6'4", 240-pound player can hit at a medium pace, make power hits, play first base, and run like the wind, Casper believes, making him perhaps one notch below the potential of Mike Trout of the Angels, whom most people recognize as the greatest player in the game. Boyd exuded confidence when he took the field for the third out in the inning for Pensacola. His long, wavy blonde hair stuck out from under his helmet, and his large biceps and triceps fit snugly into the short sleeves of his uniform. Almost all the women in the tiny gym straightened up and paid more attention to the kicker. Home attendance was at an all-time high this year, especially among the women. Casper pulled out a notebook and pen to record the match and his observations of it. He was probably the only man in the park who paid more attention to the batter than the women. With the bases empty and one out, Boyd brought the count to a close and then threw a 96 miles per hour fastball over the wall in left field. The auditorium exploded with applause. Casper, grinning from ear to ear, was furiously writing something. It was on his recommendation that the Marlins selected Boyd. Later in the game, Boyd made another pass, and the Blue Wahoos won 4-2. Casper made some more notes in his notebook and then headed to the Wahoos locker room to talk to Boyd and the Wahoos manager. Alyssa Graber and Tracy Strickland sat at a corner table in the upscale La Scala restaurant, eating a slice of cheesecake each and washing it down with a shot of Galliano. The two 30-year-olds were well-dressed and seemed to fit in quite well with their surroundings. Davy Boyd and Arturo Gonzalez were completely out of place as soon as they entered the restaurant. They came into the restaurant to celebrate their victory and were shown to a table in the center of the restaurant. "Oh, I'll take that blonde guy over there," Tracy said, pointing to Davy. Alyssa followed as Tracy shifted her gaze to a couple of ball players. "Oh, please. Those two probably haven't read a book since Sally, Dick, and Jane. $10 says they both order burgers," Alyssa said. "It's a deal. Do you know them?" Tracy asked. "All I know is that they're two members of the local baseball team. Your fantastic boy is their bonus baby. We have a big deal to make." Handsome and rich. That's always a good combination," Tracy said, and a slow smile spread across her face as the pair of athletes looked at the women. "Doesn't it bother you that they might be young enough to be our little brothers?" Alyssa asked. "Sad that I don't want to buy one, I'll just rent one for a while," said Tracy, flashing her perfect white teeth in the direction of the players. "Would you look at that?" Davy turned to Arturo. "A couple of cuties just waiting for company." Davy, as a player with a big contract and bonuses, was shopping as he usually did when he went out with his teammates. He beckoned to the waitress and asked her to bring 2 more drinks to the women at the corner table. "Did you know that both of these women are married, and the one with the shorter hair is the wife of Mayor Richard Strickland?" the waitress asked. "It's no big deal," Davy replied. "I just want to buy them drinks instead of renting a place for the evening." The waitress smiled and did as she was asked. The players watched the waitress serve the drinks and then tipped their shot glasses toward the women. The women tipped their shot glasses back. The players ate their hamburgers while watching the women talk. "Damn, boy, aren't you already entertaining that pretty blonde?" Arturo asked. "What's your point, Artie? We're friends, not married. Besides, there's nothing like a married woman. I teach Blondie how to have fun, but I bet these blondes can teach us how to have fun." "My hat's off to you, Professor." Both players chuckled. Alyssa was a banker's wife. She was 36 years old. Her partner at the table was 35. "By the way, you owe me $10, Alyssa remarked. "Hey, Dave." The players finished their hamburgers, then approached the women's table. Would you like some company for a while? Davy asked. Who do you have in mind? Tracy asked cheekily. Davy didn't have time to answer. He was a seasoned pro at dealing with women and regarded Tracy's response as the first salvo. He decided Arturo could be more relaxed. Well, as long as you're feisty, I thought to myself. Arturo is more of a gentleman. I think he would be good company for your friend. My name is Davy, by the way. Arturo and I play for the Blue Wahoos, the town's AA baseball team. I'm Tracy and my friend's name is Alyssa. I think we can talk about something intelligent for a while if you can handle it. Arturo seems like he can handle it. Maybe he can cover for both of you. Whoa, ouch, Davy said. The four enjoyed each other's company, took a second drink each, and sat for about 2 hours. Before parting ways, Davy asked for and received Tracy's phone number. Did you really just give him your number? Alyssa asked incredulously. Incredulously asked Alyssa. 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 You do remember that you're a married woman, right? A little flirting, maybe a little more, never hurt anyone. I can see he's a player. I'll just play along with him a little, Tracy laughed. As long as you know what you're doing, Alyssa commented. Heading the other way, Arturo asked Davy, Did you kick Blondie to the curb? What makes you think I'd do something so stupid? Replied Davy. Replied Davy. Answered Davy. Blondie and Tracy don't walk in the same circles. As long as you know what you're doing, said Arturo. The blonde, as the Wahoo players called her, was actually a 20-year-old Pensacola native named Jenna Wyatt. She showed up outside the team's locker room after the first game, and she and Davy haven't parted ways since. Jenna was hardly an innocent small-town girl. Although she had only graduated from high school 2 years ago, her number was already in double digits. She was young and not shy about getting her own way. At the moment, she needed a baseball player. Jenna waited for Davy the day after the game. They left the park and headed to the house Davy was renting, stopping for pizza. After disposing of the pizza and having a couple beers each, Davy and Jenna retreated to the bedroom where the double bed was. There, they got down to business. Tracy didn't recognize the number on her phone's display at first. Then she remembered that she had given her number to this young ball player 4 days ago. She giggled loudly. She didn't think he would actually call since he knew she was married. He's either incredibly brazen or incredibly stupid, she thought as she hit the answer button. Davy, how are you doing? Tracy replied in the sweetest tone of voice. Very well, Tracy. I was just sitting in my room thinking about tonight's game when you came to my mind and I decided to call. Are you home or on the road? Tracy asked, catching Davy off guard by asking what she even knew about road trips. From their conversation yesterday, Davy had gotten the impression that she knew very little about the sport and was even less interested in it. We're in Birmingham. We'll be back home in a few days. I was hoping that on Thursday night, if you don't have anything to do, we could have a quick bite to eat and a drink. You can bring your hubby along if you want. I'd like to meet the mayor. I've never officially met him before. I bet you two are a very powerful couple. Tracy caught the note of sarcasm in Davy's voice. She knew he didn't want her husband to join them, but was amazed that Davy had the sense to play the game. Tracy was intrigued. He has a council meeting on Thursday night, but I'd love to join you, young man, Tracy replied, inserting ID as a way of running the game. Over glasses of amaretto di Serrano and slices of cheesecake, they got to know each other better. Tracy kept the conversation neutral, leaving Davy to choose his own direction for the evening. He waited about 20 minutes before turning the conversation to more intimate topics. You're a beautiful woman. Does your husband mind that you sometimes go out with men for a drink? Davy asked. Sometimes I go out with men. Sometimes I meet women. I have a diverse circle of friends. My husband knows that. He also knows he can trust me, even though he knows I'm a little flirty. A little flirtatious, Davy commented. I would settle for a little flirting. And how far does that flirting go? How far do you want it to go? Tracy replied. A smirk slowly spread across Davy's face. He stretched both of his arms across the table. Tracy placed her hands on his. Evan McComb watched the pretty blonde head toward the Starbucks counter from a table in the back of the store. He noted the light freckles on the bridge of her nose and the light in her hazel eyes. He also noted that her miniskirt only came down to about halfway down her slender thighs. He knew she came here regularly and waited for her. It took about a month before he worked up the courage to finally speak to her. He got up from the table and lingered at the door waiting. When she approached, Evan took a step forward and introduced himself to her. Surprised at first, the girl reacted positively to Evan's introduction. She had seen him before in the store and was impressed with his appearance and the way he fit in his suits. They walked back to the table Evan had left and talked for about 5 minutes, after which Jenna said she had to get back to work. Evan handed the girl his phone to put her number in his contacts. Evan practically sprinted back to his job as an accountant. His coworkers noted that the usually unimpressive accountant seemed to hum as he moved around the office. Around 4 p.m., Evan's boss, Phil Cunningham, walked into his office and asked if he had won the lottery. "I got the phone number for the future Mrs. Evan McComb today," Evan stated. Phil had been Evan's boss for 2 years now. He liked the young man, but he had never known him to speak so positively about his relationship with a woman, especially when they hadn't even gone on a date yet. Evan called Jenna the next day. They agreed to have dinner at one of Evan's favorite seafood restaurants the following Saturday night. Evan awed when Jenna opened her apartment door in her version of a black dress. "So can I take that as a sign of approval, or are you having an asthma attack?" Jenna offered. "It's definitely a sign of approval, but now I'm worried because I didn't bring a baseball bat to fight off the guys hitting on you." Jenna giggled, and Evan was sure it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. They had a lovely dinner and had a great conversation. Naturally, throughout the evening, Jenna compared Evan to Davy. While Davy won in most physical aspects, Jenna found that Evan was far from a troll, and she had to admit to herself that she seemed to match him on a much higher level than Davy did. Nevertheless, she and Evan hadn't talked about their acquaintance since it was only a first date. Perhaps sometime in the future they would have to discuss it, but right now they were just enjoying each other's company. The evening ended with a chaste kiss at Jenna's door. The next evening didn't end with a chaste kiss at Jenna's door. Tracy was pleased with how her relationship with the young athlete was shaping up. He turned out to be more educated and well-read than she had anticipated, and they enjoyed spending time at a nearby museum and the opening of an art exhibit. They ran into several friends of Tracy and her husband at the exhibit, and Davy was surprised at how relaxed Tracy was about appearing in public with him. Although Tracy seemed as conservative as her husband, she knew that in another time and place she might well have been a wilder woman. None of Tracy's friends seemed upset or surprised that she was dating a young athlete, although the women's husbands were puzzled by the pairing. Virtually all of her friends knew that Tracy was a badass flirt, but to her male friends it seemed over the top. Some of them wondered how much her husband, the mayor, was aware of her latest flirtation. In fact, Mayor Richard Strickland knew next to nothing about his wife's latest adventures. Despite her tendency to take flirting too far for his taste, he had always trusted his wife to draw a line in the sand at the right moment. For the first 11 years of their marriage, Tracy had been the well-meaning wife of a successful attorney, and a little over 2 years ago, the lawyer had decided that he needed to become mayor of the small town in which they lived. At 41, Richard was 6 years older than his wife, but, like her, looked younger. His short brown hair showed no signs of graying, and regular gym sessions gave him a trim and somewhat muscular physique. By all accounts, he was a good-looking man, although he fell short of his beautiful wife. There was a little competition in the fall election, and Richard received about 2/3 of the vote. Most of his constituents were confident that he would bring the same solid work ethic to the job of mayor that he had brought to his career as a lawyer. Like most mayors, Richard had a lot of meetings, and he probably hadn't spent as much time at work since he began his law firm career. Some of his friends wondered if he was spending too much time working at City Hall to the detriment of his marriage, especially when they saw Tracy on a date with Davy. Tracy was the executive director of a nonprofit organization in town. Her job only took up 30 hours a week, which allowed her to have a free social life and still be visible. It was not uncommon for Tracy to have lunch each week in the presence of influential business leaders. In recent weeks, Tracy and Davy began exchanging light kisses in public. Tracy noticed that this was not surprising in some companies. She realized that it was only a matter of time before Davy became her first lover. Although she admitted to herself that she knew it was wrong, her growing lust for the young man overpowered her feelings of guilt. Although deep down she truly loved her husband, lustful feelings made her feel it was her duty to do so. Jenna hadn't felt guilty since the couple had first engaged in it. Mayor Richard Strickland and three other men sat in a dark corner of the city's only upscale Hungarian restaurant. They were working out the details of financing for a distribution center they were going to open in the city. The distribution center could potentially bring several hundred jobs and tax revenue to the city. He needed to stay extremely focused on the meeting. His focus waned a bit, however, when he saw his wife, accompanied by the city's baseball star Double A, slip into the restaurant and be escorted to a table in another part of the diner. And that pretty boy is a big son of a bitch, the mayor thought to himself. She's getting more and more brazen lately. He gave himself another 5 seconds to mull over what he'd seen, then re-engaged in the conversation. Davy was more animated than Tracy had seen him before. He was today's hero. 2 home runs, 3 hits, and 3 RBIs, he told Tracy. She had no idea what this handsome young man was talking about, but she knew from his smile, his liveliness, and the light in his eyes that it was something good. She knew tonight would take their relationship to the next level. Throughout dinner, Davy grew softer and softer, and Tracy watched his transformation with quiet pride, feeling that she had a hand in shaping this young man's personality. "Shall we order dessert?" Tracy asked, giving him her trademark smile. "Richard won't be home until midnight. We won't have more than 3 hours to eat this dessert." "Hell yeah," Davy enthused. 15 seconds later, they were already at it. Richard Strickland, half striding, half staggering, entered his house at 12:30 a.m., feeling like a conquering hero. His presence and work had brought a distribution center to his town, creating many jobs and increasing tax revenues. The deal was sealed over a gourmet dinner and many drinks at Magyar's, an upscale Hungarian restaurant. Now, as he slowly climbed the stairs, he remembered what he saw in the restaurant, his wife in the presence of the city's star player, Davy Boyd. As the executive director of a major city nonprofit, Tracy could have been with the player for any number of legitimate reasons, but if she had been, his very organized wife would have told him in advance. He couldn't recall a single conversation in which she'd told him she was going to meet with Boyd. Richard knew his wife was a great flirt, and he had every reason to believe that, but he also believed that her flirting was just flirting and nothing more. Every once in a while during their 10 years of marriage, he had his doubts, but every time he checked, Tracy turned out to be innocent. He hoped that would be the case this time. Tracy was the smartest paralegal Richard had ever hired at his law firm, Atterbury Salerno Strickland LLP. They started dating a year later and married a year after that. She left the law firm right after they started dating and started working for a nonprofit organization a few months after she and Richard married. Richard was 31 years old when they married. Before meeting Tracy, he had had 2 long-term affairs. He was a handsome, successful attorney, and finding a woman to date was not difficult for him. Tracy's flirting was an occasional point of contention in their marriage. Her husband had told her more than once that, in their place in urban society, her flirting was very disrespectful to him. "Stop it, Richie. You know I don't mean anything by it. I'm just having fun," Tracy said. "Please think about my feelings sometimes, Tracy," Richard replied. Richard slowly undressed in the darkness of the bedroom so as not to wake his wife. He slowly climbed under the covers and pressed himself against Tracy, inhaling first the smell of her skin and then her hair. The smell of soap and shampoo was still strong, meaning she had showered before bed. Since Tracy didn't usually shower before bed, Richard realized that his wife was no longer alone. He turned in bed so that his back was to his wife. Tears streamed from his eyes as he drifted into sleep. "So who are you dating now, girlfriend?" Sheila Williamson asked her longtime friend Jenna Wyatt as they finished lunch. Jenna blushed thickly as she pondered whether she should tell her friend the truth about dating 2 guys on a regular basis. She wondered why she felt guilty about it, since neither she nor either man had discussed an exclusive relationship. Perhaps it was the fact that Shayla had known her long enough to realize that in her 20s, Jenna was far from a virgin. Noticing the deep blush, Shayla realized what it meant. "So it's not a question of who, but how much," Shayla giggled. "Come on, spill it." Jenna looked down at the floor and turned to face her friend. She told her about Davy and Evan. "Wait, you're dating that handsome soccer player? What's that like?" Sheila asked. "He's just like you see him," replied Jenna. He's big, he's got muscles, he's got money, he's great looking, and he's amazing in bed. But it's the other guy that turns me on. Not as big, not as muscular, definitely not as rich. But he's handsome and good in bed too, and I don't know, there's something about him that turns me on in a way that Davy doesn't. We can talk about anything, and he's just fun to be with. And I miss him when I'm alone. I don't miss Davy like that when I'm alone. Makes sense? That sounds suspiciously like love, babe, Sheila said. You need to think about whether you can lock him up before he goes off to someone else. A baseball player may be fun, but love is gold. Hurry up and get him for yourself, Jenna. Jenna looked straight into her friend's eyes. She could see that Sheila was completely serious. Sometimes when Davy calls, I realize he just wants to have fun, Jenna admitted. Evan wants to be with me. There's your answer to that question, Jenna. Despite that conversation, Jenna didn't hesitate to say yes when Davy called and set up a date 2 days later. He sent a ticket to the game, and they were to go on a date afterward. Evan and his friend Scott Segura had good tickets to the Wahoos game Thursday night. When Davy Boyd scored a 2-run homer in the 6th inning, the stadium erupted in cheers. Evan, sitting 5 rows away from the Wahoos' first base dugout, thought he heard a familiar voice. 3 rows in front of him, in the row just behind the dugout where the players' family and friends sat Jenna. She was dressed nicely, but seemed to be sitting alone. Evan didn't say anything to his friend, but continued to watch Jenna over the next few games. He noticed that Davy stood up a few times and looked directly at the young blonde, and she waved her hand in his direction a couple times. Evan wasn't born yesterday and knew what he was looking at. He was embarrassed, but as she sat at the podium and pondered, he realized that neither he nor Jenna had ever committed to being exclusive. He realized that needed to be rectified if she wasn't already in a relationship with a ball player. Evan pointed his friend to Jenna and told the story of their relationship. When the game was over, the 2 men secretly watched the girl. When Davy walked out of the ballpark, Jenna practically threw herself into his arms, and they got into Davy's new Porsche. Tracy didn't notice the black sedan that followed her into the parking lot of the Italian restaurant. The driver of that car parked close enough to take her picture and see her enter the restaurant, moments before Davy walked in. He opened a thick Clive Cussler book, knowing he had at least an hour to read. Dinner took the couple a little longer this evening. They left the restaurant holding hands, then each got into their own car and drove to Davy's house. The sedan followed both cars at an inconspicuous distance. The driver filmed Tracy starting the car into the garage of the house. A few minutes after arriving at the house, Tracy and Davy headed for his bedroom. 3 hours and 120 pages later, Tracy's car pulled out of Davy's garage. A man in a black sedan took a picture of her driving past his car, with disheveled hair and no makeup. He then drove up to Mayor Richard Strickland's office and waited for the council meeting to end before entering the mayor's office. Mark Garton, a private investigator, waited until the mayor was alone and knocked on his office door. Upon entering the office, the mayor recognized the man. His bedroom is on the 2nd floor, so I wasn't able to get actual pictures, but I think it's obvious. And from what you told me about her deceased soul, I think it's a done deal. Thank you, Mr. Garton, Mayor Strickland said, as he handed the private investigator a check for his services. After the detective left the office, the mayor laid his head on his hands and cried like a baby. Breakfast at the Strickland house the next morning passed in silence, although Tracy was undoubtedly in high spirits and hummed as she moved around the kitchen. Richard looked shocked as he ate at the kitchen table. You don't look well, dear. We have an Alka-Seltzer pill in the bathroom if your stomach is not right, Tracy said. I have a gun in the gun safe. It'll make me feel better too, thought the mayor. Tracy saw no indication that the mayor wasn't just guessing her intentions. She had always thought she was smarter than her husband, forgetting that her husband's passive behavior had no bearing on his intelligence. Tracy believed that she genuinely loved her husband, but at the moment she felt that she deserved her affair with the young ballplayer. Her husband was perfectly adequate in bed, she thought, but Davy was at least 2 notches above. And she deserved it. She knew she was technically doing the wrong thing, but it felt so good that she didn't feel guilty. She knew it was a cliché, but really her affair was just entertainment. When it was over, she would be a loving and caring wife again. Richard watched his wife move around the kitchen and hum merrily, feeling increasingly irritated. He noted that he and Tracy hadn't had intimacy in about a month. As in many other families, the wife was in charge. The couple hadn't discussed having children before the wedding, but about 2 years after the wedding, Tracy decided she didn't want children. She and Richard had several tense discussions on the subject, but eventually Tracy got her way and Richard had a vasectomy. Busy with work and dating two men at the same time, Jenna didn't notice that Evan hadn't called her for a week. The following week, it suddenly dawned on her that she hadn't heard from her second suitor. By the time Jenna got home, it was too late to call Evan, but she called him the next day during her lunch break. It was the first time she'd ever had to call the young accountant. "Did I do something wrong, Evan?" Jenna asked when Evan answered the third call. Evan carefully weighed two possible options: tell Jenna that he knew she was dating Davy, or just forget about the relationship. For 10 seconds, there was silence on the line. "Jenna, I know you're dating both that star baseball player and me. I know we've never talked about exclusivity, but I can't get over the fact that you're dating. And, I'm sure, sleeping with two guys at the same time. I know I don't have his money and I'm not that big of a guy, but I want to be the one and only in your life. I want to find out if there's more between us." On the other end of the wire, Jenna's eyes widened, though Evan couldn't see them. She hesitated for a second before answering in the affirmative. "How about we celebrate our new arrangement this Saturday night?" Evan said. This time Jenna didn't hesitate and quickly added, "Yes, yes, yes." A few days later, Davy asked Jenna out on a date. She politely turned him down, saying she was now dating another man exclusively. "Well, that's great for you. But it shouldn't concern us, should it?" Davy asked. "It's not like we were looking for Brad and Angelina. We were just having fun. Can't that last as long as you're dating this guy?" "I'm sorry, Davy. Evan's not that kind of guy," Jenna said. "And I won't cheat when I make a commitment. I had a good time with you, but I think it's over between us." "Well, okay. But if you change your mind, you have my number." "Love you, Davy. I hope you have a great career." Sam Casper had the honor of telling Davy about his September call-up to the big leagues by the Miami Marlins. One afternoon in late August, he showed up at Fetterman Field a few minutes before game time. "Hey, Bubba, my name is Opportunity, and I'm knocking," Sam said as he approached Davy in the Wahoo's locker room. "Really, Mr. K?" Davy replied enthusiastically. The older man smiled and nodded. "Hell yeah, I'm in charge," shouted Davy as his teammates gathered around to congratulate him. The next day, Davy's call made the local news. Richard Strickland read the newspaper article with interest. He still loved his wife but was unsure of his next steps. He called his former law firm partner Rick Salerno. A week after Davy was drafted into the Army, Tracy's hormones kicked in. She heard her husband in his office and realized it had been a long time since they'd done this. She tried to remember the last time it had happened and concluded that she and Richard hadn't had intimacy since she had started doing it with Davy. She and Richard used to have a vibrant life, Tracy remembered. When was that? When was the last time she and Richard had even hugged? Had she really become so aloof? For the first time since the affair began, Tracy felt guilty. The young player was short on pitchers in the majors, and he wasn't on a roll enough to pick up a woman yet. "Hey kid, could you get away for a couple days this weekend? I really miss what we had," Davy said when Tracy picked up the phone. "Oh my God, Davy, I really missed you." Tracy was practically sobbing. "Tell me when, and I'll come over." That evening, when Richard got home, Tracy told him that she and Alyssa were going to go shopping in Miami for a few days, if that was okay with him. Similar requests from Tracy and approvals from Richard had been made over the years. In this case, however, Richard had in no way expected such a request and tried his best to hide his shock. Was she so desperate for his entertainment that she was willing to assume her husband was completely clueless? Did she really just want to have fun? So much for betrayal, Richard marveled. Richard tried to hide the deep breath he needed to take, but then agreed. Tracy had just given him the ultimate answer, he thought. Tracy took a cab from the airport to the apartment Davy was renting. She threw herself into the young man's arms as soon as he opened the door. "Oh, but I have to go to the stadium. It's really important, babe. We'll have dinner when I get back. I'm so glad you're here," Davy exclaimed. Tracy felt more energized and alive than she had since Davy had first left. Maybe it was the fact that Tracy was waiting for him at the apartment, or maybe it was the first of many great evenings to come. But Davy had a few hits, including his first major league home run, and scored 3 runs. He grabbed some Chinese food on the way home and practically swung open his apartment door. Tracy was lying on the couch drinking wine. He set the bag of Chinese food on the kitchen table, where it sat for the next 2 hours until a tired Davy and Tracy finally got to it. When Davy and Tracy woke up the next morning, Richard was going over his divorce petition. It was simple, 50/50ths, but Richard was only going to pay alimony for 5 years on the condition that Tracy pay her own rent and Davy not live with her. Richard realized it seemed childish, but it was probably the only win he could get in court. Evan was practically jubilant when he learned that Davy had been reassigned to the Major League team for September. He trusted Jenna completely when she committed herself to him alone, but the fact that Davy no longer lived in town was still a big relief. Jenna, for her part, realized that calling Davy to the team was good for him, but since she had committed herself to Evan, she didn't care that Davy was no longer in town. Davy and Tracy spent the better part of 3 days together, eating dinner at several upscale Miami restaurants when Davy wasn't playing ball. Tracy had felt the stares of the diners, some because she was with Davy and some because they knew she looked great. She had to admit that life in Miami seemed so much more beautiful to her than in Pensacola. Tracy felt relieved when the cab stopped in front of her darkened house. She hoped she wouldn't have to have a long conversation with her husband until the next morning. Richard sat in his darkened living room with a full glass of bourbon and watched the cab passenger pick up her bag from the driver in the driveway. He watched her walk up the 2 steps to the front door of the house, hesitate, then insert the key into the lock and enter the house, completely unaware that her husband was watching her intently. Did you have to stand up for your boring old husband after you spent 3 days having fun with a millionaire stud? Richard asked firmly but calmly. Tracy flinched, not realizing there was someone in the darkened house. I, Tracy stammered, unable to form any coherent sentences. Jumping back a foot, she froze in place, barely recognizing her husband in the darkness. In addition to being surprised by his presence and accusations, she was also shocked that he had used F-bomb directly at her. He had never used such language to his wife before. I know exactly what you're thinking, he continued. How did your stupid cuckold husband know about your trip or your lover in general? Richard sipped from his glass, and Tracy stared at him in the darkness. Although she and many others considered themselves smarter than her husband, she was caught off guard and couldn't find the words. Don't worry, Alyssa didn't give you away, Richard snorted. I knew you were going alone, but I called her house to clarify. When Glenn picked up the phone, I asked to speak to Alyssa, and he almost fell through the floor trying not to lie to me but to tell me she wasn't there. That's the problem with using a woman with a good and honest husband as a cover. I asked him not to tell Alyssa that I had called so she wouldn't call you to warn you. He felt obligated to keep my secret. Tracy sighed slightly. Since she didn't know exactly how much Richard knew, anything she could say for herself would be imprudent. Silence was the best choice in this case, Tracy knew. Richard knew it too, but the longer she remained silent, the angrier he became. When did you lose respect for me, bitch? When did you stop loving me? Richard hissed. I never stopped loving you, Richard. It has nothing to do with love. Well, maybe a little, to be honest. Wow. Honesty. What a bloody concept. Richard exclaimed, turning to his wife. Richard took another sip of his bourbon. Tracy set down her suitcase and leaned back in her chair. Okay, if I turn on the light? I want to see you when I talk to you, Tracy said. No, you just want to see my eyes to see if I believe your lies, Richard snapped back. Be careful, bitch. At this point, I know almost everything about your charade. The only thing I don't know is why. I'm not sure I can answer that question, Tracy said. Richie, you know I'm a big coquette. We've argued about this before. You were always afraid I'd cross that line, and I always swore I'd never do it. But I was wrong. There's something about him that draws me to him, Richie. I can't explain it. He was sweet, and there was just something about him. And when we started seeing each other regularly, I realized he wasn't just a ball player. He had brains in addition to brawn and talent. I guess I was a little fascinated. More than a little, Tracy, Richard hummed. And at the same time, you and I haven't had any fun in about 3 months. And then there's this weekend. Did you even go to the game this weekend, slut? Or did you limit yourself to just having fun? Do you really have to be so rude to me, Richard? Tracy said. She looked up and saw Richard staring at her intently. I was never rude to you when you were my wife, but now that you've become his whore, all bets are off, Richard said. I'm still your wife, Richard. We need to talk and work things out, said Tracy. No, we don't need to talk, said Richard. I've already figured it out. I figured it out while you were having fun. Really, Richie? Back off, Tracy. Said Tracy rolled her eyes and pressed her lips together, but this time remained silent. So what have you decided, Richard? How do you envision it? You'll be served with divorce papers tomorrow. You'll sign them, and in 30 days or so you'll be off to your boy toy forever, and I'll regain a modicum of self-respect. That's certainly not how I envision it, Richard. I'm sure we can work things out. Yes, I made a mistake, but that's no reason to use the nuclear method. Let's take our time and think it over again. We just have an inability to communicate, Richard said, mimicking Strother Martin's wonderful line from the movie Cool Hand Luke. Tracy looked at Richard with shock on her face. Polite, calm, poised Richard seemed to be taking the possible divorce in a somewhat joking manner. What's going on here? She asked herself. Richard moved his clothes into the couple's guest room. He went upstairs, made his way into the room, and locked the door. Tracy sat downstairs, her brain working hard. She wasn't thinking about the fact that she might get caught and what the consequences might be. Just as Richard had said, Tracy had gotten a lawsuit on Monday morning. Even though Richard had warned her, she was sure he would have canceled the case. The fact that he'd gone ahead with it made Tracy a little nervous. The events of the past 2 days had shown Tracy a side of Richard that she had never seen before. For the next few days, Richard focused on his duties as mayor to handle the situation. It wasn't that difficult, though, as he really enjoyed being the mayor of the town. Tracy was coping with what was going on in her life much less successfully. She spent the rest of the day on Monday in something of a daze, and things didn't get much better in the days that followed. Thursday around noon, she got a call from Davy. Hey, beautiful, how are you doing? Miss me? He inquired. Tracy's heart raced when she first heard Davy's voice. Then real life intervened in her thoughts. Richard knows about us, and has for a long time, she replied in an even tone. He knows about our date this weekend, too. I received a subpoena on Monday. Richard is your husband? Davy asked almost rhetorically. He fell silent as his thoughts began to churn. Since he knows, why don't you come back here and stay with me full-time, said Davy. We'll be back in Pensacola in a few weeks anyway, at least for the winter. Then we'll rent a place in Miami or Jacksonville, depending on where I work next season. It was Tracy's turn to be silent. Now that's the right answer, she finally said enthusiastically. How about we go back to Miami on Saturday? That's great, babe. I'll see you then. Just text me the details. Tracy put the phone away and sat in silence. It didn't take her a minute to admit to herself that while she still loved her husband, her feelings for Davy had grown so much that she was going to leave Richard for the young ballplayer. I'm sorry, Richard, she muttered to herself. Richard didn't come home for dinner Thursday night, but Tracy was sitting in the living room in the dark with a glass of wine when he appeared in the doorway around 9 o'clock. She thought it was a very ironic setting and smiled to herself when he flinched, recognizing her as she walked through the door. Hi, Tracy, Richard stammered, realizing immediately that he'd been set up. Let me get myself a beer and we can talk. Tracy had to admit that her ruse didn't seem to get Richard back on his feet as she thought it would. A minute later, Richard came back into the room with the beer and sat down in a chair, smiling crookedly. The floor is all yours, Tracy, he smirked. Richard's self-assurance made Tracy a little nervous. She started to look at the floor, but then realized her husband was looking at her in the dark. Snap! I'm going to go back to Miami for a few weeks and stay with Davy. We'll be back in October. That will give you time to sort things out, Tracy said. Are you out of your mind? Richard shouted. You're telling me you don't want a divorce, but you're going to come back and have fun with this guy for a few more weeks? I'm nobody's cuckold. If you leave, you can stay forever, bitch. Richard jumped up from his chair, poured his beer into the kitchen sink, and rushed to the guest room. Tracy smirked behind his back, truly believing she had regained her power. Tracy enjoyed spending time with Davy when the Marlins played at home, but she felt lonely when the Marlins were on the road. Davy socialized with the younger players, all of whom had young wives or girlfriends, and Tracy didn't find much in common with them. Nor did she have much in common with the wives and girlfriends of the older players, who were passionate enough about baseball to understand and appreciate the game, and she was not. Davy and Tracy flew back to Pensacola when the Major League Baseball season ended in early October. The couple returned to Davy's rented home, but after a few days, Tracy decided it was finally time to talk to Richard. She knew Richard would never take her back, but she drove to her former home anyway to pick up the belongings and clothes she had left behind. Tracy was surprised when her key no longer worked in any of the doors of the house. She wondered if Richard had guessed to change the locks. She ended up having to ring the doorbell. "Well, the prodigal whore's back," Richard said as he opened the door. "Is that what we're going to do from now on?" Tracy asked. Asked Tracy. "Absolutely," Richard smiled broadly. Yep. Tracy told Richard that she had come to pick up the rest of her clothes and belongings. Richard took her to the garage where a row of trash bags was waiting for her. He opened the garage door and told her to load them herself. She hissed in disgust. Richard grinned and left. 2 weeks later, Tracy was sure she had lost her period. Davy fell silent when Tracy broke the news to him. "We can take care of it. I'm sure the team doctors know who the best doctor is to take care of it safely," Davy finally said. Tracy began to cry quietly. "I can't do this," she said. "I can never do this." "It's okay, baby. I've always wanted to have lots of kids. Maybe not this early, but I love kids, and I've always wanted to have them." "And I don't want to," Tracy said quietly. Tracy was 4 months pregnant when she and Richard signed the divorce. He hadn't seen her since she'd moved in with Davy and didn't know she was pregnant. His face expressed shock when he first saw her. "New respect for a lover, Tracy. You never wanted children with me, but he must be much more of a man." "Well, I guess I can't say you married for convenience, can I?" Tracy blushed but said nothing. Richard's lawyer quickly pointed out to everyone gathered that Richard's name on the birth certificate would be considered perjury. "Davy knows she's his and has already committed to paying for the birth and the baby," Tracy said quietly. The following season, Davy was promoted to Triple-A Jacksonville. Since Tracy was 7 months pregnant by the time the season started, she and Davy decided it was best for her to stay in Pensacola until the baby was born. Davy rented himself a small apartment in Jacksonville for the times he couldn't get home between games when the team was home. June 27th dawned bright and sunny in Pensacola. Around noon, Tracy's water broke. As planned, she called her friend Alyssa to drive her to Baptist Hospital. On the way to the hospital, she called Davy. He told his manager and got in the car to make the 5-hour trip. At 10:47 p.m., Evan and Jenna McComb gave birth to a daughter after a 6-hour labor. Evan, who is now an assistant vice president at the accounting firm where he works, cut the umbilical cord and felt like he was flying on a cloud. Dr. Leslie Scott congratulated the couple but couldn't stay long because she had another baby on the way. She left the delivery room and walked down the hallway where baseball phenom Davy Boyd and his girlfriend Tracy Strickland were preparing for the birth of their firstborn. Dr. Scott liked the young baseball player and his older girlfriend. Although the couple was not married, she noted that the young athlete seemed to have a thing for the older woman, who was handling her first pregnancy well despite her age of 36. Dr. Scott, while noting that a first child for a 36-year-old woman is not that uncommon, also noted that the risk is higher for a 30-year-old than for a 20-year-old. Tracy was careful to watch her weight and only gained 27 pounds during her pregnancy. The doctor also noted that the ball player seemed much more enthusiastic about the pregnancy than his girlfriend. At one of their appointments when they were together, Tracy admitted to the doctor that she had a vasectomy on her soon-to-be ex-husband because she didn't want children. And the pregnancy came about by accident. It's not like these two are the first couple to have this happen, the doctor thought. While Tracy and the baby stayed in Pensacola, Davy went back to work in Jacksonville. 2 weeks later, he was sitting in a quiet restaurant with an older woman when an irate man approached them. "Who's your friend, Cassie? Does he know you're married? How many times have you had fun with him already?" he shouted to the couple. The restaurant became quiet. Davy looked back and forth at Cassie. Cassie stammered a few times before Davy hopped off his chair and moved to face an older man who looked a few inches and pounds smaller. When the police and ambulance finally arrived at the restaurant, Davy was lying on the floor. His right eye was swollen shut and beginning to water. Harrison Walker, a construction worker and husband of Cassie Walker, had cut and bruised knuckles on his left hand. His wife was still sitting at the table sobbing. Davy was still in the hospital when word of the incident at the restaurant hit the news. Of course, Marlins management was not happy that one of their highly paid players had suffered a potentially career-threatening eye injury. Tracy wasn't happy about the news either, especially when she learned that Davy had been at the restaurant with a married woman. Such a coincidence didn't escape her. "Son of a bitch!" yelled Tracy, not addressing anyone in particular. The noise woke her infant, who began to cry. No stupid act goes unpunished, the woman thought. Being only human, Richard Strickland couldn't help but smile when he heard about Davy's beating. At the same time, he felt not an ounce of compassion for his ex-wife and her predicament. She made a bad choice, he thought to himself, slightly twisting a phrase from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Pensacola police declined to press charges against Harrison Walker, especially since witnesses claimed the fight was started by a ball player. Richard Strickland asked one of his employees for Harrison's cell phone number, and the mayor called the construction worker, giving the name and phone number of his divorce attorney. He also heartily congratulated the young man on his victory over the ball player. 2 weeks later, Tracy and the baby, whom the couple named Frederick after Davy's favorite player, Freddie Freeman of the Atlanta Braves, moved into a smaller apartment that Tracy was renting. Tracy had her attorney contact Davy to arrange child support and visitation. She was still collecting alimony from Richard. As fall turned to winter, Marlins management was very concerned that the blurred vision in Davy's right eye was not going away. Insurance covered the contract, but nothing could make up for the player's potential. Hits, home runs, runs scored. Life as a single mom was taking a toll on Tracy both mentally and physically. After her divorce from Richard, she lost most of her friends, and the few that remained were unwilling to socialize with a 30-year-old woman with a child. She had lost only half of her baby weight before leaving Davy, and in the 14 months of living on her own, she had gained about 15 more pounds. Her chic closet no longer fit her and was pushed to the back of her closet and drawers, its place taken by mom jeans and bulky sweaters. Her hair had grown out, and more often than not, she just pulled it back into a ponytail. Twice the mayor stood at a four-way sign in downtown Pensacola and watched an elderly woman pushing a baby stroller through an intersection when she twisted her ankle and fell to the ground. Being a gentleman, Richard Strickland turned on his blinkers, got out of his car, and went to the woman's aid. As he approached, she looked familiar, and he made sure of it when he helped her to her feet. "Hey, Tracy, it's been a long time, hasn't it?" Richard said quietly, peering into her face. In the shock of her fall, Tracy didn't recognize the stranger who had come to her rescue. Only the voice gave her away, making her look closer at the Good Samaritan. He looked like an aged version of her ex-husband. There was gray in his hair and wrinkles on his forehead and around his eyes. His eyes no longer sparkled. Instead, they looked kind of sunken despite the small smile he bestowed on her. "Thank you for the hand, Richard. I guess I've gotten clumsy in my old age," Tracy replied. "If you're old, I must be ancient. Don't forget I'm 5 years older than you. Let me stop the car and give you and the baby a ride home." Tracy waited while Richard parked the car. When he pulled up again, Tracy told him that she was healthy enough to walk home, but if he had time, she wouldn't mind having a cup of coffee with him at a cafe half a block away. Richard thought there was more pleading than asking in her eyes, so he nodded affirmatively. Tracy pushed the stroller ahead of her as they walked the half block to the coffee shop. As they walked, Richard's brain was working overtime. He looked at the baby's face and thought sadly that in another life this should have been their child. He shook his head to chase the thought away, and Tracy cast a quick glance to the side. Pushing those thoughts away, Richard couldn't believe that the woman he was walking with was his ex-wife. Although it had only been 3 years since the divorce, Tracy seemed to have aged about 20 years in that time. When he first saw her, Richard had thought she was the child's grandmother, who was probably 50 or 55 years old. She only slightly resembled Tracy, who had once been his wife. Richard ordered coffee for himself, a salted caramel latte for Tracy, and warm milk for the baby. He had to admit that the baby turned out to be cute, a good mix of mother and father's features. "You remembered. How cute," Tracy said as she tasted her latte. Richard blushed slightly. He just ordered without thinking. It was a reflex. So how are you doing, Tracy? If I'm not getting too ahead of myself, are you seeing anyone? Tracy knew Richard wasn't being intrusive. He was the same as he always was, a nice guy. I haven't dated anyone since I broke up with Davy, Tracy replied quietly. It was a real shock to me. I guess karma really is a bitch, but it gave me a chance to get a taste of what I've been feeding you. Yeah, it hurts. I guess it gives you a little sense of revenge. Tracy's voice choked. Tears stood in her eyes. Richard sat in silence. Once upon a time, he might have rejoiced at her sad news. However, after 3 years, Richard's anger had subsided. The sadness in his heart was replaced by revenge. I'm so sorry to hear about this, Tracy. Really, I mean it. I don't hate you anymore. I feel sorry for myself and for you, for what we lost and what could have been. And to this day, I don't know why. It took me a long time to fully figure it out, Richard, Tracy admitted. I kind of lost myself there for a while. I guess I saw it as a way to indulge my secret fantasies of being a bad girl. I thought I deserved it and could keep you in the dark, even though I wasn't really hiding anything. I thought I could have my cake and eat it too. Turns out my cake turned to shit, and all I got out of it was a lousy t-shirt, so to speak. And in my stupidity, I offended a good man and threw it away. I'm sorry, Richard. I say that quite sincerely. Well, look on the bright side, Tracy. There's something good in all this. He's a great kid, and at least he'll be around for you to enjoy growing up. Tracy looked very guilty at that statement. I know you didn't want kids, Tracy, but it just happened. When God gives you lemons, make the most of them, and never let him know he's not wanted. You have a tremendous capacity to love. I know that firsthand. Tracy began to cry quietly. After a while, Richard handed her a handkerchief he had in his pocket. Of course, Tracy thought to herself. What about you, Richard? Is there someone in your life right now? Please tell me I haven't messed up your attitude toward all women. There's no one right now, Tracy, but I'm an optimist. You know that, Richard said. I guess I'm still a little apprehensive. Someday I'll come around. Tracy lowered her eyes to the tabletop so Richard wouldn't see how guilty she felt. Richard felt awkward. It was time for him to leave. He got up to leave, but Tracy covered his hand with hers to stop him. Richard took the hint from the many years he had spent with Tracy in the past and sat back down. Richard, what's the chance? I mean, you're alone, I'm alone. I know I screwed up once with the best guy a woman could ever dream of, but I won't make that mistake again if you give me a second chance. I can promise you that. Tracy raised her eyes and looked directly at Richard. He stared into the distance with a millennial stare for 5, maybe 10 seconds before he showed any emotion, and only then furrowed his eyebrows. God, you can't believe how much I loved you, Richard whispered, causing Tracy to lean closer to him. I so wanted to believe that you were just flirting with him when I saw you together in that restaurant. I always knew I wasn't a Greek god, but I truly believed you loved me. Maybe even loved me as much as I loved you. I gave up the possibility of having children. I really wanted children. You knew that. But I gave them up because I loved you. And you betrayed my love, betrayed my trust. And to top it all off, you had a baby. A baby by that goddamn ball player. I may not be angry anymore, but forgive and forget? Not in this life, baby. Richard stood up and walked away. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.